So the theme of this evening is you must go on, I can't go on, I'll go on. Who knows who wrote that? Beckett! I will buy somebody here a book if you can tell me what book it's from. Who? What? Say that again? Oh, it's part of the trilogy. But it's actually unnameable. But yes, you win. I will buy you a book of your choice. Okay. So this is a quote that we often hear, and it seems particularly pertinent today. How do we bear the unbearable? How do we act in the face of forces that threaten to sort of crush us or paralyze us? Certainly feeling that in this moment. And it's also the central question of the three books we're going to be talking about today and hearing from the authors. So let me say a little bit about each book and each author, and then I'm just going to invite them on the stage. I'm going to start with Anelise. So we're talking about, okay, let me do this. I hate public speaking, by the way, sorry. Okay. Sorry to disrupt the piece. It begins with an adopted Korean-American woman waiting for an IKEA delivery when she gets the news that her younger brother has killed himself. Dear Cyborgs is about two Asian-American boys who bond over a mutual love for comic books in small-town Ohio. And then So Many Olympic Exertions is about a PhD student who struggles to finish her thesis about sports, who is thrust into further crisis when she learns that an old college friend of hers has committed suicide. So what I've just described is sort of just a synopsis of what these books are, but like all great novels, they're about so much more. This doesn't begin to scratch the surface, so I'm really excited to get into that tonight. So we're talking about Anelise's novel tonight, but if you haven't already, I'm telling everyone to check out her series of essays right now in the Paris Review. She's writing about mollusks, but it's also about art, shame, life, death. And she's a young writer here in New York, and I really admire her about, when people think about like, how do you survive in New York as a writer? I think she's really doing it. And what that looks like is she's teaching at Columbia. She edits fiction here at the workshop. She writes a lot of literary reviews in the Village Voice, and she writes for the New Republic. It's just like how you cobble a life together as a writer. Check her out. You can find her writing in all those places. So, Patty, so you can find Patty's work in Bomb, BuzzFeed, and the Right Review. So glad she's here tonight. And I just want to say something about her book, which is that you will, if you read the book, if you haven't already, this is a character you'll never forget. It's an incredible voice. I'm so glad that she exists in literature. And we're going to hear that voice later. Eugene Lim, he is the author of two earlier novels, Fog and Car and The Strangers. He's also the founder and managing director of Ellipsis Press. You should check out those books. He also works as a high school librarian. So his book is out right now, so we're reading all the reviews. Let me just quote one of them. It's been hailed by New York Magazine as one of the most striking literary works to emerge from the Occupy movement. And it is also about, besides the two Asian boys that I mentioned, it's also about the lives of superheroes sort of off and on the clock. And it's also about social protest, and as one critic put it, it's about the fraught possibilities of making art and having left politics under capitalism. Almost done here. So, that's kind of heavy stuff that we're talking about, but I should just say one of the things I love about these three authors is that they're just really hilarious. It's very dark humor. And like all great comedians, their timing is impeccable and their tonal control is amazing. So as a writer and as a reader, I think these are three people to study for that. So with no further ado, let me bring Anelise Chen on the stage. Thank you.
Didn't know I was going to do standing up. Okay. Well, the real reason I can survive in the city is actually because of wonderful friends and community members. One of them is Lisa. So many of you are in this room, so you make life here possible. Thank you so much. Okay, so my narrator is a PhD student, and she's really failing at the immigrant high achieving thing, because she's studying American studies, and it's about sports. It's completely it's a hopeless endeavor, pretty much. So she's struggling, and I'll just, read a little bit about her encounter with her advisor. One of my good friends is in grad school, and he said reading this book gave him PTSD. So yeah, hope it's not triggering for anyone. All right. I'm sitting in a narrow office with my co-advisor, Philippe, who has made me go see him in New Haven, where he teaches, even though we both live in New York. I've spent months trying to get his attention, and now that I've finally gotten it, I'm blowing it. Apparently, I'm saying a number of incorrect things. According to him, I could have just averted the disaster by bouncing ideas off a critical colleague. It's true, I haven't done this, though I don't see how it would have helped. In this interdisciplinary program I'm in, we're just doing different things, combining our various fields of interest into surprising arrangements like Dada artists. Since none of us share a common idiom, it's impossible to collaborate. Did you know so-and-so? This and that, so-and-so? If the answer is yes, then we can keep talking, but if the answer is no, then the conversation has to stop right there. I don't even know what my colleagues are working on, really. The best I can do is identify them with a few word combinations, like Salem witch trials, that's Sarah. Turtlenecks, jockstraps, feminist reworkings, that's Diane. Library culture, Henry. And accidents with concrete, that's Jack. Mina keeps telling me to leave aside what sports mean and focus on what they signify. Consider the historian Bernard Joux, a wonderful jeu, like J-E-W, like game. A wonderful case of nominative fate, who theorizes that all sports are a meditation on death and violence. So maybe that's what I'm doing, getting a degree in sports and death. Human history is so full of trial and error. I think of poor Patrick Fitzgerald, the long-distance runner in the late 19th century, whose doctor treated his stiff legs with a brand new invention, the scarificator. It was a contraption that had 16 retractable razor blades that could spring out like cat claws with the push of a button. The doctor used this instrument to slash Fitzgerald's thighs in 32 places to help ease the pressure during a final stage of a 6-day race. Unfortunately for later runners, the procedure was deemed a success. Fitzgerald managed to set a world record. The trial and error method applied to training as well. Early runners often collapsed during endurance events because they followed bizarre, counterintuitive training regimens. Drinking water was considered a sign of weakness, yet brandy and wine were considered fine to drink. Another popular performance enhancer was strychnine, also known as a rat poison. Trainers also encouraged runners to walk. These days, long-distance athletes know that they must train and race carefully, monitoring their effort with precision. But the most intense competitors also know that restraint is antithetical to victory. Whenever he felt his body giving out, record-breaking marathonist Derek Clayton would do the opposite of what it wanted and drive it harder, famously running straight into a tree. He was ruthless in other ways. Once a competitor noticed that he'd missed his water stop, so he kindly offered Clayton his own bottle. After drinking from the bottle, Clayton was about to hand it back, but then, reconsidering, threw it far away so that his competitor wouldn't get to drink from it himself. I'm on the phone with Mom reporting about my week. I leave out the details of my visit to New Haven. Suddenly, Dad picks up from the other room. "Be more like Forrest Grumpy," he says. "What?" "Do something stupid. One day he wake up and he say, 'I want to run,' and then he go outside and he runs." "Dad, I don't have time to do anything stupid." "See, daughter, in your inner core, you're free. Everyone's free. But your sixth core tells you, you are worthless. You are nothing. You can't do it. Karmic energy out of balance." "Really?" "Yeah, I don't know. I forget all the cores," he says. And then, as if unable to hold back the flow of Tao or unwilling to tiptoe any more around the perimeter of eggshells I've scattered around me like voodoo, Dad blurts out, "I bet your friend who died didn't like to run." That night, I try to stay very still. I sit at the kitchen table and read like a statue. I'm a silver robot in a tourist seaport, waiting for the perfect moment to burst to life. I'm sweating through my makeup. It's hard to maintain the posture. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. This book is a novel about a woman investigating her brother's suicide. It's supposed to be funny, but I guess you can decide if you think it's funny or not. I don't know. I thought it was funny when I was writing it. So, in this scene, the narrator is flying on an airplane from New York City to Milwaukee. Okay. I stared out at the gray and brown flat grids, laid out simply and locked together like pieces of a child's puzzle. Then I looked down at the lake, glass smooth like a French bistro tabletop. I pictured my adoptive parents' house, and for a moment I pictured the funeral sweater's arrival in a cardboard box addressed to Helen Moran. It was with great pleasure that I pictured myself trying on the sweater, a perfect fit. Then I remembered I was going to my childhood home for a horrific reason. My eyes continued to water until the plane landed and I took a taxi home. I've never paid too much attention to interstitial spaces, like the space between landing and arriving, bland, forgettable spaces without texture, oatmeal spaces. I knew the ride home would take 20 minutes, and during that interstitial space, the sky became darker and darker, as if someone were slowly placing a black blanket over my eyes. My stomach trembled, saliva welled up inside my mouth. I swallowed it. I tried to trick myself into thinking I had just sipped a glass of spring water. A teacher said to do that. Instead of letting us go get a drink of water, she told us to think of a Swiss mountain stream and to swallow our saliva. The taxi crawled forward like a beetle through the suburbs, stopping and starting, stopping and starting. And I saw in my head the nunnery where all the nuns died and the priests took over, the pharmacy that housed a child pornography ring, the bird sanctuary where a governmental agency collects the geese to feed to wolves. It had been years since I had been to my childhood home to see my adoptive parents. It was by some unspoken agreement that as my adoptive parents and I became older, we would come into contact less and less, although I couldn't say for certain why that was. I didn't even tell them I left Milwaukee until months after the fact. At the time, it satisfied me to do that to them. To disappear for a while felt like getting some kind of revenge, because throughout the 18 years I lived with them, they each on various occasions asked me to leave, to move out and find a new place to live. In the end, I suffered for my revenge, because when I moved to New York, unspeakable things happened to me. I'm sorry I'm not looking up and making eye contact. Like, these sentences, I don't know, they're a little long, so that's just what's happening with that. So thank you for understanding. Everything bad went around in a circle. Gray streets and black skies filled my head like heavy stone tablets, causing me to feel a throbbing pulse near my left temple. In the pitch black darkness, I felt the taxi coast down the hill of my childhood memories, causing tears to come to my eyes, a physical descent that must have been buried deeply in my subconscious, and so we arrived at my adoptive parents' house, the House of Morans. I don't want to be here any longer than you, and therefore I'm hoping my stay will be very brief, I said to the driver as I gave him 2 wrinkled 20s. I asked for change. When traveling, it's always useful to have a little cash. The taxi left, and I stood for a while outside the house. It began to rain. In silence, I walked around the backyard, through the oak trees and bushes as a few motion detector lights switched on and swept across my lone figure at a delay. By the time I made my way to the front door, my coat and shoes and canvas suitcase were soaking wet. I rang the bell and the door opened. I was greeted by 2 little astonished ghost figures clinging to each other for dear life. Helen, my adoptive parents said, "We weren't expecting you." No, it wasn't entirely clear to anyone, not even to the 2 who had raised me, how I had ended up at the front doorstep of my childhood home. They appeared to be shocked by my canvas suitcase. Instead of greeting me pleasantly, they were whispering to each other. How was it that no one was certain Sister Reliability would return home after her very own adoptive brother passed away? I might have been a monster, but not that kind of monster. It hurt me a little that my adoptive parents were not expecting me, that they were so astonished by my arrival, that they seemed scandalized by my suitcase, by the suggestion that I'd be staying a few nights with them in my childhood home. I supposed if they themselves had called me, I would have been able to tell them my travel arrangements. Instead, a stranger called me, a relative I hadn't spoken with in years. How avoidant they are, I thought. They couldn't bring themselves to tell their own adoptive daughter her adoptive brother was dead, the person she grew up with, the one she was forced to take a bath with, a tepid bath before he was toilet trained, the one who pissed in the bath, while she, the adoptive sister, sat calmly in a tub filled with a combination of tepid water and his urine. They didn't have the mental and emotional strength to tell her that he was gone. And not only was he gone, he did it to himself. Thank you.
Hello. It's great to be here. Thanks to the workshop, and I'm excited to talk with Lisa and Anelise and Patty. I've loved all their writing, and I love these two novels very much. Dear Cyborgs is a book about, as Lisa said, two Asian American boys and kind of their friendship as they grow older. And it's also about superheroes, but not in the conventional sense. Their day job, they are superheroes, but mostly we see them at a Thai restaurant or a karaoke bar, and they're just talking to each other. And the structure of the book is largely monologues. One person comes on stage and tells her his story, then fades out, and the next person comes on stage. And so I was going to read two short monologues by the superheroes. First time, I think, they're at a Thai restaurant. He's a superhero, but he was also a writer, and he starts and he says, "I was a writer," I continued. "Maybe I still am. I don't know, sometimes I still try, but I have a bad case of block. What happened was about a decade ago, I published a collection of short stories. These were old-fashioned moral tales disguised as science fiction. The stories revolved around the affairs of young technocrats who discovered that the mechanized times they'd created had, alas, made them, without their consent, no longer human. Back then, I thought my stories were brave and maybe even visionary. Now I think they're heavy-handed and a bit riskless, but for whatever cyclical and lucky reason, the book was a minor hit. I saw it displayed flush out in all the better bookshops. It had decent sales, and I was given a contract in advance for a novel that I outlined to my agent and publisher in purposefully vague terms. I went through that advance very quickly and without having made any progress on the proposed novel. Even though I was trying daily to deliver what I'd promised, I couldn't bring myself to do it. It wasn't writer's block then, not exactly. At the time, I knew what was expected. What was expected was a slightly modified coming-of-age novel that traded on my Korean-American identity. Something not too obviously an assimilation tale, and above all clever, yet also something not too much a deviation from that sellable idea, so that the marketplace of culture could easily absorb my story without being too discomfited. Even if no one had said this aloud, to me it was clear as day that this was the assignment, and I was willing to do it. It wasn't ethics that seemed to make the job impossible, but rather, I think, an underdeveloped sense of humor. I couldn't laugh it off. I couldn't get in the right mood. To sell that subject, which, to overgeneralize, is one step past the melodrama and pathos of the first generation's suffering, that is, in order to sell the second generation's schizophrenia and double agenthood, one needs to pepper the thing with jokes. So you can say, see, I'm no victim, not only, I'm in on it, am injured by living in two worlds, but yet whole and not broken, in fact, fortified and special in my elasticity, in the ability to be both of and other. That took a certain comic ability I discovered I did not have. Many months went by, and I delivered nothing, but then my agent called me with an offer. She knew the novel wasn't coming along, and that I was hurting for money. A certain Chinese-American politician, really ex-politician due to a recent scandal, needed a ghostwriter to help him with his autobiography, which he hoped would help rehabilitate him or at least firm up his legacy. Even though I was untested and frankly not a little naive, simply because we were both Asian American, even though it made no sense, people thought to put us together. He had been a city council member and a two-time mayoral candidate before a fundraising scandal brought him down. He needed something different, therefore, to allow him to rise from the political ashes, something more than just the usual inspirational pap. If he'd wanted the usual, all he had to do was fill out the bio he stumped with, and which got reproduced with prominent placement on his ineffectual campaign pamphlets. No, he told me when I met him, before a series of marathon interviews, he needed something much more poetic and complicated. he needed a biography that detailed darker subplots in his life, perhaps odd sexual awakening or drug abuse stories, perhaps lessons from having to bear witness to financial misconduct. Who knew what exactly? That was for me to figure out. But whatever I came up with, it had to be placed somehow in the reader's mind that these experiences from which this man must have the appearance of having emerged, if not unscathed, then at least uncorrupted, had also imprinted upon him the worldly wisdom that would give him the insight to make just the right compromises when amid the deafening roar and blinding whiz of the legislative machine's incomprehensible moving bits. It was an impossible job to make a lyric and relatable poetry out of the mundane shortcomings of a commonly ambitious man. I signed up immediately. All of a sudden, the globby lump of inability I'd confronted for the better half of the previous year, a time spent trying to strategically fictionalize my identity, began quivering with potential. Practically before my eyes, I began to witness a startling alchemy. I saw this piece of constipated shit, the themes and events of my short life, transmuted into a golden narrative that I channeled into a roller coaster picaresque of eventual triumph from darker forces, something that came to be gloriously subtitled The Jack Who Story. I was ecstatic. The anonymity of the ghostwriting contract gave me permission permission to use all the underhanded, emotionally manipulative tricks I couldn't have borne to see enter the world under my own name. But knowing that these would merely appear as a higher-end version of hack work, what harm, I thought, could it do myself or others? I labored hard, through weeks of punishing all-nighters and a month of rewrites. On the other hand, I discovered how untortured writing can be when telling other people's lies. 2 seasons later, I saw my efforts introduced in the world in hardcover, with an embossed and impeccably designed dust jacket, my name, of course, nowhere found in this glossy and heavily marketed product. And then a mere few election cycles later, the man, now a senator, I was touched, robocalled me late at night to remind me as one of his staunchest supporters to get out the vote. That's one. Okay, so that's one story, and here's another short one. Now they're at a karaoke bar, and they're swapping stories. And one of them says, Dave said, I met this guy at a bar who happened to be a night guard at the Frick Museum. And he said he could, since he knew I was a painter, only a Sunday painter, I'd said, whatever this guy had said, if I was interested, let me into the museum after hours. So he set it up, Dave continued, somehow with his bosses. He was a gregarious guy who was difficult to say no to. And so one night, after closing, I met him at the museum around 10 o'clock, and he gave me the run of the place. Henry Clay Frick, the man who had collected all these works by Dürer and by Delacroix, these paintings by Watteau and Kirchner, at the time he had collected them, was dubbed the most hated man in America, for he was a vicious capitalist, and it would be as if Dick Cheney and Jeffrey Skilling and the Koch brothers were one man and had begun collecting all the Donald Judds and Robert Smithsons and all the Joan Mitchells and Julie Moretus and all the Joanne Greenbaums and Paul Chans as a historical machine, a timeless massager of their reputations, so that instead of a villainous and rapacious, murderous bigotry and egotism, we instead only remember dimly this rough history, seen through a glass darkly, and it is as if we were blinkered and blinded by these beautiful and profound works of art placed before our eyes to shield these evil men of power from true and righteous judgment, and to shield us too from the wearisome task of carrying out that judgment. See, I'm winded just saying so. And so I was ecstatic to be allowed into the museum, this mansion, at night, when I could roam its halls and peer at the paintings as if I owned them myself, or even more as if I were in some cosmic dance with them, some intimate relationship with these 19th century masterpieces, these works by Fragonard and Whistler, these works by Vermeer and Constable, by Goya and Titian, by El Greco and Eng. And it was, initially, a sublime, sweet, and slow walk through its intimate galleries and down its halls, the museum at night. But after a few hours of this, after living out the fantasy of being alone with these paintings, I realized there was something immensely lonely about the experience, or that it was something so ecstatic it had to be savored jointly with some other soul or souls, or else the solitude would ruin the taste, would transform the sweet into bitter, the wine into vinegar. So I left the museum, came out into the cool night, and walked for hours and hours digesting what I had just seen, my mind overrun and seized with both beauty and sadness. At dawn, I came up with a plan. This was, I recognized, a high point in my life. I couldn't just leave it, which I realize now was perhaps unwise, and I thought I have to do it again. But this time I have to bring somebody else. And so I invited this woman I knew. She happened to be an art critic. Actually, she was an arts blogger. Well, in actual fact, she was a data analyst at a corporation and worked 80 hours a week building profiles of you and me and everyone else we know so that targeted messages would have us buy just the right moment, just the right brand of diaper or automobile or colonoscopy. For her tireless efforts, she was paid huge sums with which she bought the combinations of Xanax and marijuana and cocaine and vodka that helped to ease her often ruffled psyche. But in a previous incarnation, she held down waitressing and dog-walking jobs so that she could get through an MFA in studio art, in, quote, multimedia, which she claimed was a vocation, and this turned out to be true, for which she had no calling. However, these days, on the side, because she was immensely talented and energetic, which is why I was drawn to her, she contributed under pseudonym to one of the city's more widely read art blogs. She made it a point to spend all of her scarce free time going to galleries. In fact, this was where I'd met her, standing in front of a painting we both happened to admire. We casually exchanged comments. Mesmerizing, so beautiful, makes it look easy. And that was that. But then her face popped up several weeks later on OkCupid. So a month after my first visit to the Frick, my friend quite generously arranged for it to happen again, except this time I was bringing along a date. At first it was just as before, but better, because it was still a fantastic privilege to wander that space and live for a few hours with those paintings in a bubble of private intimacy. But it was even better because one could share that wonder with another person. And so that wonder, the ecstasy, the joy, became reflected and built up by some harmonic into a golden, gonging mutual pleasure. But she kept talking. She talked the entire time. And it wasn't that what she was saying was so wrong or so pedantic or so pandering or so not up to the moment. These things were true. But they were true about what I was saying also, and I too was talking the whole time. We were commenting on our experience and the exegesis which was necessary to make the sublime more human, more touchable, turned out to be the thing that tarnished it irreparably, secularized it if not made it profane, and so turned the transcendent ritual into a bauble of anecdote. Fucked alone, and if not alone, likewise fucked, concluded Dave. Thank you.
So I think what happens next is the writers get on the couch and they hold their mics, and I sit in this red chair and hold my mic. Is that what happens? Okay. And we're gonna just ask them a few questions, and then I'm very soon gonna open it up for the rest of you to ask them questions. And thank you for hanging on in the under the ceiling fans. How are your mics doing? Testing. All right. I think they should be on. Oh, you're supposed to tap the... Oh. Is it the bottom? Help. Oh, here
Hello.
comes Andy. Ah, how did you do it?
Hello.
Okay.
All right. Patty's on. Annalise is on. Okay. So, gosh, I wonder where to start. Well, I guess I could start with a convention of superhero narratives, which is the origin story. And I wanted to ask each of you, just to start the conversation, sort of what, a little bit of what the origin story was of your book, sort of what was on your mind when you were sort of thinking about embarking on this project that probably took each of you at least a year or two, if not more. Can you say a little bit like what you were thinking at the time or what you were hoping to write? Eugene, you want to start?
I'll start. I wrote the book in the latter part of the last part of the Obama administration, probably in like 2012 to 2016, and I was not thinking of writing a political novel. I didn't want to particularly write a novel that had as its principal themes politics or protest, but the times were so that I was getting absorbed and obsessed with this kind of moment where it seems impossible to protest. It seems impossible to resistance is a big word right now, but to resist without that resistance being co-opted in some way. And so even though I would have liked to have written a long lyrical novel about something else, what was obsessing my mind at the time was were these issues that of neoliberalism, and which have gotten even more aggravating now. And so, but I was obsessed about it. So even kind of against my will or against my desire, I was obsessing about them. And so when I sat down to write these stories, those were the issues that were coming out.
Annalise?
Okay. Yeah, I started writing the book in 2010 during the Vancouver Olympics. I remember it was Valentine's Day. I was sitting on a hotel bed and I was watching the men's luge, and I was I was in a bad frame of mind. So when I was watching the men's luge, and they were just like clutching the sled so desperately. I still don't. I should probably figure out how the luge works. But it honestly just looks like they're falling down a chute really fast. Like there's no strategy to it. So I was like, wow, that's amazing. That's exactly how I feel right now. That's exactly what life feels like. We're just clutching onto this. Oh, I just spit. We're just like clutching onto this sled and like going through this tube really fast. And I think, yeah, so I had been thinking that because someone had, this Georgian luger had just luged out of the tube before the games began and died. So then this event got compounded with the fact that, I had I received news that my friend had passed, committed suicide. And this was happening while the Olympics were going on. So I was just watching the Olympics with this new lens, and I thought, like, I just couldn't stop watching the Olympics. And so then I wrote this whole book because of it, because I was like, why can't I stop watching? Sports has so much to say about life and death. And I hadn't, really been interested in sports before this. It was like a many-year obsession when I would just sit in the room and watch a lot of YouTube videos. And then this book happened, so.
I started my book in 2016, so last year, and I remember actually at the end of 2015, I lived in New York City, and I stopped reading contemporary fiction for a few years. I just wasn't reading anything new. I was reading just these old books, I guess. Old, I don't know. But I knew that I wanted to write like a voice-driven novel. A lot of my favorite writers are dead. And I guess the other thing that I was haunted by was I was just very obsessed with Fiona Apple. So I was thinking a lot about her and her music, and I just wanted to write something graceful that was powerful, And of course there's like a personal matter that inspired the book, but I don't know. I always feel a little weird talking about that, so that's just that.
And Patty, I know your writing has been compared to Thomas Bernhard and Robert Walser, but when I read it, I also kept thinking about Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, so this sort of obsessive psychology.
Yeah.
You're just like totally wrapped up in this person's brain.
Uh-huh.
So it's a good thing. The second question I have is sort of about genre bending. I think each of your books, well, Annalise and Eugene, both of your books have been sort of praised by critics for upending sort of conventional narrative strategies. But I wanted to start with you, Patty, because one of the most provocative blurbs on your book is from Ed Park, who calls it a Korean-American noir. And then also in the LA Review of Books, they call it a stylized contemporary noir. So,
Yeah.
And I know that, what happens in the book is that Helen wages this sort of intensely incompetent investigation into her brother's
Yeah.
suicide. And
That's right.
at one point he goes hunting for his her brother's dental records, like that becomes really important to her. And then she spends like a lot of time analyzing this like heavily discounted coffee book about cars
Right,
that
yeah,
that she finds in his
definitely.
room, and just like. So
Yeah.
I wanted to start with you and just ask you about that
Well,
genre
Sure.
thread and sort of
Yeah.
how you went about it.
Well, when I saw that blurb, noir, I wasn't thinking of noir, when I was writing this book, but I was thinking of Murder, She Wrote, the TV show with Angela Lansbury. She's like this detective, and she's not, I mean, why is she a detective? Like she's this writer, but she's also solving mysteries, and like she doesn't really know what she's doing, but she is like a very kind person, and usually by the end of the episode, well, always by the end of the episode, the mystery's solved, So I guess I was just thinking about mysteries in terms of Murder, She Wrote.
I have a friend who's a huge fan of that show. She's like,
I love it. I love Angela Lansbury.
So Eugene, you talked a little bit when you were reading about where you take the superhero universe, and one of my favorite sequences in the book is Frank Exit, the hero and the supervillain. They're in a chase, they're jumping into motorboats, they're hanging off helicopters, they're knocking over fruit carts, and in the middle of this, Frank Exit thinks to himself, why did I stop writing poetry? So I wonder if you could say more about like how you were, what you were thinking when you were sort of upending this, thinking about superheroes in their off hours, I guess.
I don't know. I like superheroes. It's not like I don't like superheroes, but a lot of the book is what's it called? Kind of appropriating the tropes of superheroes, or using the genre and the excitement or the suspense elements of these propulsive narratives, whether it's noir or superhero actions or action scenes in movies, and it tries to use them to bring the reader, keep the reader coming along, in trapping the narrative with some momentum, but also it kind of freights on that ride other ideas. And so that was what I was, that's kind of what I was using genre for, less as an homage and less as kind of a love of those things. And I think that sometimes that backfires for a reader who expects a different kind of use of that genre. But I don't think disrespectfully. I'm not against a ride sometimes, but for me, it was less important to fulfill these genre expectations than to use that propulsion, that momentum that genre gives us, and do something else with it.
Yeah, I think we both sort of did the same thing where I also thought, so the problem, I mean, I had a really, really hard time structuring my book, and that's why it took so long to write. But so basically what happened is I wrote the entire book, we sent it out, I got rejected everywhere, and then I was like just in bed, like just Netflixing. It was so miserable. But then I watched two really important movies. I watched Frances Ha, and then randomly, it's not my favorite movie, but anyway, this is part of the story. And then I watched Café Lumière by Ho Xiaoxin, who he is one of my favorites. So the thing that I discovered about both of these was the importance of movement. So the revelatory moment for me about Frances Ha was like, oh yeah, she's just like, a lot of stuff happens to her, like shitty stuff, but she's always moving around. Like she's like, there's so many shots of her just like running across the street or running to her friend's house, and then she like gets on a plane and goes to Paris. It was like, that's the key. That's how you get people engaged, is you just make your character move around a lot. And the same thing happens in Café Lumière, because if you've ever watched it, it seems like a really boring movie, because all it is just a girl who's like trying to find a composer, and we don't even really know why. She is trying to find him the whole time. So it's it's a search once again. She gets on trains, she gets on buses, she walks, and that's the whole thing. And I was like, why is this so gripping? I'm like, oh, it's because she's moving and she's searching for something. Like, that's all you need for a story, is just the movement and the search. So yeah, once I got that, then the rest of it came along pretty fast.
So Annalise, I think Annalise's book comes out next month, and I predict that a lot of the critics or people who talk about it are gonna focus on these sort of sports anecdotes that you all heard just now, but also is woven throughout the book. But there's one aspect that another sort of genre that I wanted to ask you about, which is the self-help aspect of the book, and which is not the first thing I thought of when I read the book. But so I'm just curious to hear how you think of your book
I
where
wrote
that
it into
thread
my
is.
own copy. I wrote, "This is a self-help book." Because I have a really bad habit of reading literature as self-help. It's just a horrible place. Like you said, all my favorite writers are dead. It's almost like, why you go to the most depressed people for self-help? It's a bad idea. But I always, anyway, I end up reading writers for self-help. But yeah, like my sister and I are obsessed with self-help. We read a lot of it. It just makes you feel less lonely. You're not the only one out there. The weird thing about self-help is that when you go online or if you're looking at a book and they articulate your problems so well, they're just like, yeah, this happens. It's almost like everyone is one person. Like everyone is having the same problem. And that's like really reassuring. But I don't even know if I answered your question. Yeah, self-help is an important part of my life. Oh yeah, I bought this. I used to go so I wrote a lot of the novel in Cole's Gym, which like doesn't exist anymore, but right across the street is Mercer Bookstore. And I would go there and just look at the self-help section. I would always just be buying like Depression for Dummies. And they just didn't respect me at all in there.
So
Do they really have a book called Depression for
Yeah, I still have it. It's in Lisa's basement.
I'm not reading it. So let me switch gears and talk. So back to the sort of the theme of tonight, which is how do you go on, and thinking about sort of survival strategies, which I think each of your books gets into. And so the cover of Patty's book is a waterfall, and it's this image that she gets, or forgive me if I'm misremembering, but like I think a therapist or a shrink recommends, like you want to calm your mind, just visualize a waterfall. And then one of the greatest tensions in the book that is fascinating and is just really fun for the reader is this tension between Helen, who's sort of blind to her own sort of manic and weird impulses, but she's also very intensely self-aware, where she's a woman who has a very strong conviction about who she is. And I just want to quote something from the book and have you talk a little bit about this tension, which I think is sort of the secret to her being alive. And I'll just read the quote now. So this is Helen, I have always identified with the victims, the underdogs, the colonized, the beggars, the bacteria in the sponge. I will have my revenge someday on those who overlooked me my entire life. All the people who underestimated the power of my will and my life force. So it's such, you have to read the book to understand how awesome this is. She is such a great character. But can you talk a little bit about sort of that self-aware, not aware aspect of her and what you were with that in the building in the character?
I think that she's rather delusional, but I think most people are delusional because how can you really see yourself? It's like very difficult to do that. So everyone has blind spots, I guess. But I guess the funny thing about her is like what she chooses to pay attention to, that's kind of how she gets lost because she's paying attention to the wrong things, And I think that's what happens to people when they're in like a mode of trauma, or like something traumatic has happened. Your mind will just like cling to, it could be anything. It could be videos of, the luge, So I think that, I mean, what were you asking me exactly about that? Like, what was it?
One critic I read who reviewed your book said that her central obsession is sort of about why is my brother dead and I'm alive? That ends up being her. And then what we experience in the book is this very peculiar person who has managed to sort of survive And well, I guess you kind of answered the question. Just sort of like, how do you make this balance, this tension with this character? I just wanted to shout out for that.
Can I ask a question
Yeah.
to your question? So I'm curious how, so the narrator has a brother, and she's always comparing herself to her brother, like, I'm like this, my brother's like that, and then comparing and contrasting, and Bernhard does that so well. And I was just wondering if you sort of highlighted, or you like exaggerated the traits of the two characters so that they could become like a dialectical almost.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that the book is just a mode of exaggeration, you know. The book itself is just ridiculous, you know. So that exaggeration is there for like a comic effect. You know, if they looked exactly alike. I mean, yeah, they needed to be different, you know. One person asked me if they were the same person, which was great, you know, that was awesome. So,
Like schizophrenic.
no, yeah, he was like, oh, I think that she has like multiple personalities. And I was like, you know, I think this reading is more about you than it is about anything in the book. So, I mean, I said it in a nice voice, you know, I said it wasn't that harsh. It was very friendly voice, you know.
So Eugene, as sometimes happens when people review books, there ends up being like a line that people keep coming back to in it. And I'm finding that one line that is capturing people's attention is early on in your reading, you're talking about like how, you know, what we're all protesting out there. Is it futile? Is it worth it? And then in your book, an Occupy demonstrator compares protest to dance, music, and religious ritual, a spiritual act where the act itself is the goal. And then so Hua Xu, in his review in the New Yorker, said, you know, reflects on your book as a whole, and he writes, one thing artists, superheroes, religious believers, and protesters all have in common is that their work is never done. And then so I wanted to ask you, like, what was were you thinking of that theme as like sort of when you integrated the artists, the superheroes, thinking about yourself writing the book and under this time of protest? Yes, or the sort of the protest, or the protest can be a goal in and of itself. Like, it's okay just to stand there and like with your sign and not feel bad that it's not going to change the world, or that your book is not going to change the world.
Yeah, I think that the idea of protest is super important. It's important for people to show up, but it does feel fraught. I mean, I don't know if I'm going to guess that a lot of people feel that there's a lot of self-doubt and uncertainty about its effectiveness, or its the ability for it to be either co-opted or for things, for the purpose to be ignored and deflected into some other easier purpose or even nefarious purpose. So protest is been I thought of as fraught, and I think that we think of as having a lot of conflict and uncertainty. So the book is a lot about questioning about the possibility or the impossibility of protest. So one simple answer that one character comes up with is, well, and I think it is simple, but I think it's very moving that you do what you can to an extent. And she tells a story which is a riff on this nature writer, Lauren Isley. And this is a story that I think I learned in some kind of church story or something. But there's this debased version of it where a guy is having this spiritual crisis. Like, how can I go on and how can anything good happen in this world? And he's on this beach. And this beach is this weird tourist destination where the surf throws up on the beach sea life. which dies because it's not in the sea anymore. And the tourists scoop it up and they eat it. They boil it for sea stew. And he's walking on this beach in his spiritual malaise, and he comes across this guy, and this essay is called The Star Thrower. And he comes across this guy throwing a starfish, picking up the starfish and throwing it back into the ocean to save its life. And the guy who sees this and has a spiritual crisis goes, why bother doing that? This kind of holocaust of sea life is happening constantly. What difference could it possibly make for you to chuck this one fish into the ocean? And the response in the version that I read or heard was the guy just picks up a starfish and throws it, and he said, well, it makes a difference for that one. And it's a very simple and almost overly simplified way of thinking about direct action or thinking about trying to do good. But it's useful for me sometimes to have that kind of simple notion of just trying to do what you can do in that moment.
And this is my last question. I'm going to open up to the rest of you all. But Annalise, I wanted to ask the same question in a slightly different way, which is that so your book grapples a lot with sort of like failure, and this Athena Chen ends up sort of feeling alienated from her own goals. Like, what is the point of my thesis? What am I doing? And so there's a phrase that we all know now called first world problems, which has become the catchphrase for the afflictions of the privileged. And I think in both your nonfiction and fiction writing, I really feel like you have become, to me, this very eloquent describer, commentator, spokesperson for what I've come to think as sort of second generation problems. In other words, the sort of anxiety and the guilt that many of us feel about our various pursuits in light of our hardworking immigrant parents who sacrificed so much for us. So I guess that ends up being a really powerful, for me, part of the book. And I wanted to have you, we haven't talked all about family yet, and Athena's parents are in there, her sister's in there. Can you tell me a little bit about working them in and how you were thinking of them as not only like building the main character, but just that element of the book?
Yeah. So throughout the book, part of the problem is that she keeps trying to justify to herself like why she's trying to pursue this PhD, which the use value of it, right? And of course, like the PhD is just a stand-in for like writing. Like what? Like how dare I attempt to write a book? And it's really funny because like one of the very first chapters of the book, I started with this memory of like a recurring fight I would always have with my mom. It was called the "What is the point" fight. And so the thing is that like she would always tell me to do something like, oh, go clean your room or something. And my rebuttal would just be like, what is the point? Because I wasn't trying to be sassy or anything. It was just that like I could already sort of see, like my mind had leapt ahead and I could already see, oh, like my room is clean, but then entropy would immediately set in and then I would just have to do it all over again. So why don't I just save my energy and just leave it messy? You know, so like, I don't know, for some reason I just became this person who budgeted everything so carefully, like my energy, my exertions, like I just needed to account for it. It was always this precise calculus of like, how can I get the most out of my time, out of my energy? I was really frugal in that way. And I think that comes from coming from an immigrant family where like every little thing counted and you had to make it count. So to think about like doing something like writing, it's like the ultimate expenditure and you just have to let yourself do it. And I think that's partly why I became so interested in sport, because it's like useless expenditure for no reason.
I knew there was a reason I hated sports.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, exactly. It's like wasting money.
All right, so thank you so much, Patty, Annalise, and Eugene. It's not over yet. I want to open it up to the audience. If you have any questions for them, I'm going to call you out. Just say your name, raise your hand. Anyone? Anyone? If you don't ask, I will ask. Hello. Hello.
This question, wow, this is really loud. This question is for Patty. Hi, Patty. You have said, I mean, I've seen this elsewhere, that the book is really funny. And I often read things that other people say are funny and find them tragic. Like when I read Catch-22, I was like, this is a tragedy. I don't understand why everybody finds this funny. So I don't know if you run into this I mean, maybe this is just me being weird, or maybe a lot of readers are like, what's funny about this? This is really sad. So I'm curious.
About other readers or?
About why you think it's funny.
Oh, why do I think it's funny? I mean, I think it has something to do with the cheerfulness of it. It's like pretty cheerful for a book that's about suicide. Like the narrator has this very like cheerful voice as she goes about what she needs to do. I think there's something funny about that. For me personally, that was very funny. You know, for some people, I mean, of course, I think the book is very sad too. You know, like I'm not like, you know, I don't think it's just purely like a comedy, you know, it's like a dark comedy. But I think that like, you know, Curb Your Enthusiasm, like that's a very dark show, but it's that guy, Larry David, he's like very cheerful, you know, it's got this like cheerfulness. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, right here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Rosanna, and this question's for Eugene. Yeah, you talk a lot about your book mentions several art forms as a means of protest. So I'm thinking about painting, poetry, and several of the characters you mentioned. You mentioned those different art forms in order to characterize the character. And the most memorable one is Sunny. I really enjoyed that part, and I was just wondering if. How are they different, like painting versus poetry, in terms of protest?
Can you say a little about Sunny?
A lot of the, thank you for that. A lot of the artists, the poets, the painters, the writers, their occupation is there, I think, to demonstrate the difficulty of putting to practice this philosophy of protest or this philosophy of purity. There's a paragraph in the very beginning of the book speaking about the artist kind of starts in a nascent form as someone who tries to be pure and then eventually becomes this contemptible character who just barely tries to signal to other people who are artists of like-mindedness and has given up any kind of hope for changing the world or for any kind of impact on the world. They just want to try to be a parasite and signal to other parasites, hey, look, we're having fun. It's something like that. It's said a little differently and hopefully a little better in the book, but that's the so there's a little bit of pessimism in terms of the potential for the artist, whatever their medium. And Sunny, the person that you mentioned, is this kind of conceptual artist who only makes, she's supposed to be a very brilliant painter, and she makes only 12 canvases at a time, and you can't buy her paintings. She will only sell you, she won't even sell you the 12 that exist at any one time. She has a conceptual use of her work where every month she paints a new painting and destroys the oldest painting, so that in a course of a year, only 12 paintings exist, and you can't buy those 12 paintings. You can only contractually buy her work, so that at the end of every month you have to give the one to be burned, and then she'll give you a new one. And so it's a gamble whether she's going to be what she's going to do in the course of her life as she makes these 12 paintings, whether she's just going to paint 12 middle fingers to the purchaser in the end, or whether she's going to continue to make her brilliant painting, so-called. So, and that's just, and she is inspired by an artist that several of us are inspired by, Zhi Qingxie, if I said it right. The performance artist, the Taiwanese, the illegal immigrant, really, who did this series of brutal conceptual performance pieces. The one that strikes me as the hardest is where he punched into a clock every hour for a year. So that's kind of constrained him in time and space. He couldn't leave. He couldn't go farther away than he had to get back and punch it every hour. And he couldn't sleep more than an hour because he had to punch in. He had other pieces. Lisa's working on a book, this incredible artist. But he says, and it's quoted in the book, something like, art isn't really capable of changing the world, but it can unveil it. It can kind of reveal how it works sometimes, or how it is. And so that's useful. And I've forgotten the point of your question, but I think it's I don't know if I thought about each poet, visual artist, or filmmaker, or writer, if I thought of them very differently, as opposed to using each medium to demonstrate this point of both the compromises and the futility and the difficulty of staying either pure, and similar to protest, being pure to your initial intention, how close you can get to it, what you can really do with it.
So I'm going to ask a provocative question, which is that, so I've never been to a reading where somebody stands up and asks, so do you consider yourself a white writer or just a writer? and I've been to a couple of Eugene's readings now where that question has come up, and sometimes it's asked by an Asian and sometimes a non-Asian. But I think I wouldn't be surprised if Patty has encountered that question too when her book came out in March. I'm kind of curious, like, so the question is trying to get like what is Asian American literature and all that, and so we're here with a bunch of Asians, and I'm curious, this sort of a meta question, like when you hear that question, what do you feel like is going on there, and how do you, what is that question about?
Honestly, I've never been asked that question. I think sometimes people are a little, they don't ask questions like that to me perhaps because I'm adopted. I don't really know. Like, I don't know. Maybe, I don't know why they don't, but I've never been asked that question. And as far as like what's going on with that, I don't know.
Well, it's just a kind of policing about what you can and can't write about as an Asian, as someone who's non-white. Like, either you write about Asian characters, and then it's like, well, why are you only writing about Asian characters? Or you don't write about Asian characters, and it's like, why aren't you doing that? So I was just watching this interview with Charlie Rose and Toni Morrison, and she shuts him down so fast. Because he said something like, when are you going to write about white people or something? But anyway, but it's just absurd. Anyway, I don't know where I was going with that. Just, it's a cool interview.
I think that the question gets asked. I think there's a shift that's happened. Like this place, this Asian Americans Writers Workshop, when it was at St. Mark's, or when it was, it's changed. And I think that the older board members would joke. I have heard that this is a running joke in this place, where initially, when it started, not that long ago really, it was just a bookshelf or a shelf, and now it's expanded to the room, and it has a significant library. That's a huge shift in a very short amount of time, actually. And the reason why it's exploding now is because I think I'm the oldest of us, but historically there was a big change in immigration law in '65, and so a lot of the first wave came. My parents came post '65, and then we're the first. In some ways, there's a big generation of second. Their children are coming of age, and I made this joke at another reading. I didn't make this joke, but I said this joke, which is a Kurt Vonnegut joke. That true horror is when you wake up and you realize that your high school class is running the country. And I said this joke to a high school class, and that didn't go over so well. But to a bunch of high school kids. But if you're older, if you're a little older, the joke is funny because at some point you get older, and 35, 40, a little older, and all of a sudden you're like people in power. You're cardiologist, your senator, whoever they are. They're suddenly your age, or suddenly they're a little younger than you. So a generation is, what I'm getting at is, a generation is coming into power. The second wave of Asian Americans are coming into power, not only as writers, but also the gatekeepers, the editors. And so there's this explosion, really, as we can see almost manifest around us, of Asian American narratives that are not that first wave of assimilation tales, or tales about resistance to assimilation, or the conflict of assimilation. And so that question comes up because the reading public, it's not a blaming thing, but they're expecting this first kind of story, and they go, "What? This is different. What is it?" So it's kind of insulting, but it's also it's interesting that the question gets asked because it means that this change has been happening, and this.
Right, they're recognizing the shift.
Yeah.
And trying to figure out.
Yeah, and so I think it's for me, the question is always annoying, but it is kind of exciting that this is happening, and that this reading is happening, where the 3 experimental Asian American novelists are on the stage, and we have they're very different formats than what was done 5, 10, 15 years ago, definitely.
Anyone else, or scratching your head? Hello.
Hi, Eugene, I want to press you on that point a little bit and was wondering whether the three of you can talk about how the Asian American characters in each of your books, sort of the questions that they grapple with or the struggles that they have that is unique to them, and how their identity both is manifested in that and how it, leads to the questions. I mean, Anelise, you talked a little bit about the struggle for perfection and, that immigrant mentality. So could you each talk a bit about how your characters struggle in that sense?
So when my novel went, it was interesting to get the reader response after it went out to submission. But some of the editorial letters I would get back, like I remember I got one rejection letter and I was like about to go into a bike store, and I read it and I was so furious because it was something like I don't understand why the narrator doesn't just quit school if she doesn't like it. And then I was like, are you kidding me? Like, of course you can't quit. You're going to tell your Asian parents you're going to quit school? That's totally not in the realm of possibility. But anyway, there was just a fundamental inability to understand sort of, I didn't have an audience in mind when I was writing. I guess I was just thinking about writing towards someone like myself. So a lot of the editors who really responded to it were Asian American editors. So there was just something that was they were able to get the story in some intuitive way that was more difficult for other editors.
I noticed that both Annelise's book and my book had the phrase imposter syndrome in them, and I realized that in that piece that I read in the beginning, I read it in this room because I wanted to talk a little bit about, or to present this idea of the second generation's problems are a little different from the first generations, and so there is this. Not to, I guess, too generalize, but the obviously there are exceptions, but the idea of your authenticity comes about more. Annelise has a great monologue by her mother, by the character's mother in the piece, where the mother says something like, you obviously can say it better, but whenever I think of somebody who bothers with philosophical questions, I think, what a luxury.
Yeah, like that, like the fact that you can even wonder, like, what does it all mean? That in itself is a luxury, because the first generation, they don't have a choice. They wake up, they go to work, they come home, they're tired. There's no time, to be cogitating. I don't know.
I think my characters, they're both adopted, the brother and sister. So they're raised in this very white suburb by white parents. So I think for those two characters, it's a question of belonging, where do you belong, more than any kind of racial question, I think, just in being adopted inherently there's just this question of like, where do you come from? Like, who are your parents? You know, like, are they the ones that raised you? Or are they the ones that actually give birth to you? You know? So, yeah, I think it grapples more with that.
Hi, yeah. I would love if all three of you could address this. Um, I'm like perpetually amazed by the ability of like successful fiction writers to assume a voice of a character, no matter how they craft the story. Um, so like you're just speaking on authenticity. Um, so could you like speak on how you sort of navigated the importance of voice as you were writing your novels? Whether that be like writing them as a lot of the parts of your novel as monologues, or like using voice to like make a dark situation kind of funny. And if you have experience writing other genres, how dealing with voice is sort of different when it comes to fiction.
I think like for my book, like the voice is like the most important thing. That's like what's driving the book. There isn't really a plot or a story per se. It's just the voice, and you like follow this voice. The voice, that's what's the most important thing. So, what was the rest of? I'm sorry. What did you? Oh yeah, no. Like, what was your question? Just like what is the importance of it, or what did you say? How did I deal with it? I mean, I'm a big fan of voice-driven novels, so that's mostly what I read. Like, I don't really read books in third person anymore. I did, like, you know, in high school and college, and then, you know, now I just mostly read first-person narratives because I really enjoy being absorbed into someone else's mind and voice, you know, like, that's very important to me, so, yeah.
Yeah, so now I'm teaching a nonfiction class. I see some of my students out there. I make my students like record themselves. They tell a story and then record themselves and then transcribe it. Because I think, yeah, it's a really great way. I mean, that's like the most obvious way to get voice is to transcribe someone speaking. So I used to do that to myself. I would shout, like I would write. I just basically use my own voice in my own book. Yeah.
I think the choice of style, the choice of voice is really important. It's one. I think there are three main elements in fiction. There's these events or plot. I don't think of it as strictly as plot, but these events in time, and then there's the sense of personhood, and then there's the style of the book, and all three are interrelated, and the voice or style. And there's this, and I'm an adherent to this phrase of Robert Creeley's, the poet's, where he says something like form is nothing but an extension of content, and vice versa. Where form and style is very important, and it is reflective of the content. Often, it's not even just reflective. It's inextricable from. It's defined by. So, I think of style. I think of choices of voice a lot, actually, and that what I think often happens is that people default into a style, and that defaulting is kind of a default into an ideology or a default into these tacit assumptions about how to tell a story. So being conscious of trying to take up a particular voice, whether first person or otherwise, and the style of that, I think is important because you don't, you are more conscious about the type of writing you're doing. You're not defaulting into this. I think about it a little bit in fashion. Like clothes, people want to be innovative and hip, and they all end up dressing the same, right? There's this herding effect because there's this ideology of what is hip, or there's this atmospheric default mode, and I'm less. It bothers me less in fashion, but in novels, I think it's useful to be conscious of those default positions and press against it or push against it. So I think style is important, but it's difficult to see those choices of style because often there's also this idea as a writer where you where you get in a state of flow, right? And you just the writing speaks through you, right? And in that moment, you kind of go that the style is almost choiceless, and that's a good feeling. So it's a balance, I think, or those are two different aspects of choice of style, which I think are interesting.
Hi. This question is for Eugene Masley, but I was thinking about the passage that you read earlier about the second gen feeling the need to demonstrate both otherness and not otherness in this schizophrenic way. And I remember being struck by your book, how there's so many conversations between Asian people, between the protagonist and Vu, between the protagonist and the woman that reminds him of Vu's sister, between Frank Exit and Miss Mistletoe. And I think what struck me there was like the tenderness between those characters. And I was wondering if you could speak more about what it was like writing that, because I feel like I don't see that often.
You mean the way people speak to one another?
When there's no burden of proving that you're human as well in the schizophrenic second gen, super funny way.
I think that they're attentive to each other's stories in one sense, but I also made the book a series of monologues because, and there's a joke in it, like one person will say a monologue, will say a long story, and then the next person will say, I know exactly how you feel. Precisely, I know exactly what you're saying, and then launch into their story, which has nothing to do really with the previous story, perhaps. So in other words, this thing that we do where we've all done it. You're in a phone conversation, we're talking with friends, and it's a series of monologues. We're not listening. We're just waiting to speak, or that's a common way to describe conversation, right? Conversation is actually a series of monologues where you're just waiting to speak. And so, in some sense, the book is a joke on that idea. To your point, I think about the friendships, especially between Vu and the narrator. I think that they are. My previous book was about relationships. Was about relationships, the intimacy between people, and also kind of this unbridgeable distance, where with your friends or your family members, there's kind of a basic human inability to be intimate, be one with another person. Simultaneously, there's a lot of things there's a lot of ways where there are a lot of things that we share. So that kind of so close but so far away aspect of human nature, I think, is important to me, and it seems to come up in my books a lot. And in that sense, I think the characters are talking to one another, trying to be close, but recognizing kind of this unbridgeable space between themselves.
So one of your questions making me think about one of the blurbs of Eugene's. You never really go to blurbs to get like insight into books. They're basically like, this is a great book. But I did read Peter Ho Davies' blurb of you, and what he said was, beneath a dry wit, there's an ache of loneliness, an echo of every comic book reader's yearning for the camaraderie of the super team. So I think what the questioner was sort of picking up on is that the superhero, it's not Batman, right? It's Team Chaos. It's the friendship that evolves with the superheroes, and that's really a thread I saw between Patty and your book. Is people often talk about invisibility being sort of an Asian American theme. I think like loneliness is a big one too, especially for Asians who've grown up in mostly white places, which I never did, but I feel for you guys. So I just wanted to throw that out, just like that part of the book I think is like what is, we talked about the survival strategies, it's to have your comrades, and as Anelise said in her when she got up on the stage, it's this community that we have here.
I think it's great to have, but I was just going to shout out one part of Patty's book, which speaks to that, which I love your book because of the because I identified with the alienation of living in the Midwest as an Asian American. And there was one part, if I remember correctly, where the brother, she says something about the brother's habit of pretending to be the only person in the world, I think, or being being alone in the world, I think, being the only person alive, and it being a source of comfort because he didn't have to perform or for whatever reasons. And I thought that was devastating and also something that, this might be an assumption, you can't make up. Like, that's a game that you come across and you use. You don't like, that seemed personal. That's all. And it was a devastating use. I don't mean, maybe it came from in the creative process.
I don't know what part you're talking about.
But
is it near the end? Is it?
I don't
No,
have
it's
my
okay.
copy,
We can
but-
talk about it later. I'm actually
but
not remembering what that is. It's amazing.
I
right?
thought, well, okay, but
I don't know.
thought,
It's
I
in
thought
the
it was
book
a really
somewhere.
moving.
I just don't remember.
I thought it was-
You know?
I'm not sure if I'm saying it exactly right, but the brother says something like, or she says something about the brother playing a game or imagining himself alone, and
Yeah. You're right. Yeah, I'm sure it's.
it was a beautiful and devastating moment, and I
Thank
think
you.
about it because because of Lisa's point about in addition to invisibility, the alienation, and the Venn and the idea of an Asian American growing up in a white space, I think is one that is one of the other narratives that is coming up as the diversity of Asian American narratives explode.